Well, thank you. We're going to keep going here, and they can join us when they arrive to the high school. My first my first question, and I do want to make this interactive, and so I want you to participate. There will be microphones around. Is what kind of globalization one wants, and where do children fit into it? Is it luxury or decency to care about them? But before we get to that, which is a core point of what we will be talking about today here, I want to convey to you something that happened yesterday inside the forum that was, I think, one of the most compelling and important questions, and it was asked by Mrs. Khan. She asked Colin Powell, maybe some of you have read it today at the newspapers, if the urgency was such in Iraq vis-a-vis what the US policy is towards that country, that a human catastrophe must be accepted. She talked about refugees, she talked about children that will suffer if a war comes to the place, and I think that that could introduce us with a larger sense of reality to something that is not philosophical. The fate of the children out there depends on policies that we grown-ups decide upon. So I would like to take 5 minutes, no more than that, to address that before we go back to what you're here to listen to and what you have to tell the audience and share your ideas with the panel. Irene, you want to take upon what you asked Mr. Powell, and if you're satisfied with the kind of answer that you got?
Well, I asked Mr. Powell, how do you balance the threat of war with the threat of the military attacks producing human suffering? Children will die, refugees, and so on. And I think when I looked, as I was asking the question, I looked at his face, and I felt that he didn't have the answer because no human being could answer that. But it does, and I was not satisfied with his answer because we are deeply distressed with the consequences of that. And I was not satisfied with the answer. And I'm still looking, and I just hope that the message from here and from everywhere else will be to get governments to focus not about geopolitics, but about people's rights, about the situation of ordinary people, of children and elderly and women and so on.
If indeed the US government has information about what they call the clear and present danger that Mr. Saddam Hussein presents to the world and to his own population, by the way, one must also stress that, the day after, organizations like Terre will have to be there and will have to take care of what is going on. Bernard, do you want to share with us your thoughts on Iraq?
Yes. Good morning to everybody. I am Bernard Boeton from the Children's Rights Department in Terre Foundation in Lausanne. And I am working on children's rights, generally speaking, but on some other specific issues. About your question, I would like to say that I heard on BBC this morning, live, that the main issue of Davos was the consequence of the possible war on Iraq on the stock exchange of the world. We are sorry. We agree, of course, but we are sorry. There are maybe some other collateral consequences from the war on Iraq. I heard, I was not present, but I heard that the last sentence of Mr. Colin Powell yesterday was kind of preventive war for the future of the children of our world. May I say that in our view, it's an insult to the children who will die if there is a war. If we have a preventive war to save the children of the world, maybe we should innovate and create a new concept, which could be a preliminary minute of silence before the war for the children or the civilians who will die. I remember I read the first sentence of the speech of Mr. Mahathir, Prime Minister of Malaysia, yesterday or day before yesterday. In the world today, there is no trust or little trust and governance is not good. We have in fact made a mess of the world. 2 millennium of experience and mountains of knowledge have not made us more capable at managing our affairs than Stone Age people. And sometimes we feel that in our movement we are fighting for more than 40 years. We were in the Algeria war, in Biafra, in Vietnam, in Rwanda, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. And it is always the same. It seems that nobody learns from the previous wars. And once more, we will try to mobilize our volunteers to raise money to help the victims.
Well, thank you very much for that.
It becomes unadmissible for us. And I would say, final word, God bless Iraqi children. We are not taking position in that conflict. The other side is criminal. For years and years, we know, everybody knows, there is a lot of intelligence in that world. Where is the willing? Where is the will to react against this, what is presented as a fatality? It's not a fatality.
The sense of urgency introduced by the head of the Child's Right Unit of Terre, I think, is for what you just expressed now, shared by many. But one must also think that this sense of urgency does not relate only to war situations, which have been present, as you were pointing out, in the humanity history as far as we are able to remember, and coming from all sides, because there's also that to be said. The amount of violence applied by Mr. Saddam Hussein to his own Kurdish populations and others is something not to forget. But let us move to the core issue of what we will be discussing here. And I would like to introduce the General Secretary of the International Textile, Garment and Leather Workers Federation, Mr. Neil Kearney. I will introduce you, Madam Minister, in a second. But Neil can talk to us about the core question that we have. Is it a luxury to have children's rights? And is it something that you have to look out when, as a consumer, we are all consumers here, as a consumer you're getting out and buying something, the kind of labor that is behind that product, and how you deal with the moral issues around child labor and consumers?
You use the term children's rights. What are children's rights?
Tell us on labor.
In many countries around the world, it is unknown. I suppose now, just at this moment in Bangladesh, it must be 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. Children as young as 4 years old are still working. They would have started this morning maybe 7 o'clock, and they will continue to work until they are too exhausted to do anything more. They will then take a blanket from beside their sewing machine and lie down on the floor to sleep. Where are the rights for those children? We have there a situation of the greed of employers who want to use children because they are cheaper, 5, 7 children for the price of one adult. And remember, if we're talking about Bangladesh, we're talking about a monthly salary for an adult worker of only $17 US. And we, all of us, are benefiting from that because we are buying the clothes that are manufactured there, and we're buying them with a certain degree of complacency, because how often do we pose the question, how were these garments manufactured? We ask, Is it cotton? What are the washing instructions? Will it fade? But how often do we stop to ask, how was it produced?
Who should we be asking that question to, Neil? How would a consumer, because we know for a fact that you don't purposely go out and say, I want to profit of the labor of this 4-year-old. Who should you ask? How can you know how a garment has child labor? Or any other product? We were talking about toys, which is a paradoxical thing. Toys for children made by children.
Yeah. Often, of course, the tragedy of the situation, toys made by children for children to play with who are older than those who actually manufacture the toys. But you ask a question, where should we raise our voice? We should raise it in the stores, in the retail outlets, in the shops. We should ask, under what conditions were these items manufactured? Can you guarantee me that children were not used in the manufacture? Now, some of the stores will respond rather harshly to you, but you are the customer. You have a right to know. And if we were all to raise our voices in stores here and across Europe, across North America, in the consuming countries of the world, we can turn our shopping trolleys into vehicles for real change. And if we were all to do that, I think we would get away from the situation where today there are 250 million children working. Half of those will never go to school. And another sobering fact is that more than 1 billion adults are illiterate. Illiterate because they never had the opportunity to go to school, because they had to go to work. And today's working children will become the parents of the next generation of working children. It's a shame on all of us
but nevertheless,
that we don't raise our voices all the time and eliminate this evil, because it is evil.
It is indeed. But nevertheless, it's a more complex situation. And I would like very much for the Minister of Health of South Africa, Mrs. Manto Tshabalala, to talk to us about that, because you and I come from poor countries where you're right, there is child labor, but if you take those children out of work, the suffering on the families is enormous. I'm not justifying child labor, I'm just introducing complexity into this. It's not only black and white. What happens with a South African child, Minister, when you take them out of work? Are there programs to help those children get an education and somehow and a healthy life, and somehow aspire at least to stop the cycle of poverty?
Thank you very much. Let me start off by saying, I think with this new dispensation in South Africa, we really stand a good chance. We have decided, South Africans, to put children very high up on our agenda. So some of the issues that are being raised about child labor are issues that we are raising in South Africa and making sure that we eliminate child labor. We, in the first instance, took a decision that we were going to ratify the Children's Rights Convention. And we think for us, this was very critical and important, because then it gave us a legislative framework in Parliament for us to be able to do those things which we think are absolutely correct for the children. The children are our future. We love our children. Every one of you knows what we have gone through as South Africa in terms of oppression and also in terms of oppression of our children. We then set up a sectoral national strategy, intersectoral national strategy. We now have in place what we call a national plan for children. And we're very proud that that national plan is beginning actually to bear fruit. Yes, we still do have some pockets where in our country things are not as good as we'd want to see them. But we then engaged all the stakeholders in our society to say these are our future, these children are our future. We've set up institutions and structures to ensure that we then implement our plan of action. But I think what is more important also is that we are allocating as government enough resources, in my view, to attend to the needs of the children. Every end of the year, President Thabo Mbeki will call every minister to say, what have you done? So you've got to give a report to cabinet, to the nation, about what you've done in the interest of the children. Certainly, we're faced with a very big problem, eradication of poverty. It's a huge problem. But we don't think that we must subject our children in the process of trying to eradicate poverty. We now have universal primary education in South Africa, and each and every street in South Africa is supposed to supervise each and every house to ensure that children do go to school. Of course, you get children who themselves are street children and so on. But even then, civil society is assisting us in this regard. I think we've been fortunate also in the sense that in the last 7 years, we've been able to reduce child mortality by half, all because of the dedication of our society. Let me just say also something very interesting happened last year. The Minister of Finance and myself have been asked to be EPI champions for South Africa. And we're working very closely with the Minister of Finance in this regard to ensure that he does allocate enough resources for expanded EPI. So we're working very closely. But I must say, whatever I'm saying now, I'm not saying we're 100%, but we're trying the best that we can. And we're not going to allow our children to face child labor simply because we want to address issues of poverty. Thank you.
So investing in children rather than seeing that as an expenditure. Bernard, you want to say something?
Yes, one information. As far as I know, the goods product produced by exploitation of children, the level of goods exported is very, very low. That means even if you and me and everybody in our European or Western market, we are very strong against by checking, as you said, by checking from where it's coming these goods.
Making a weapon of your shopping cart.
That's right. It would not solve completely the problem. The basic, you asked the question to whom we should address. We should address to the state. The right for education is the matrix of all other human rights. And if, in the context, in the debate about globalization, if the public service of education in the world is becoming private or given to private companies or initiatives, this basic universal right for education will be completely destroyed. So we have to choose between public service and private service.
It's interesting that this morning there was discussion about the state coming back. The big corporations, the big money owners of the world are saying publicly to themselves and publicly that the state is coming back. So it would be interesting to see if that trend, which is very clear in security, airports all over the world that were outsourced to private companies to take care of, we know how well they have taken care of, are now going back to federal surveillance. Irene, what are the roles of state, private, and civil society in terms of human rights and of children's rights? And then, but when we end this, I would like to pass on the microphones, if you could help me, to the people on the audience, so that we have this as a dialogue.
As the Minister mentioned, of course, the responsibility of governments is very important, and we do have a Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's 14 years since we have the Convention, and 40 years since the UN unanimously adopted a declaration to give that which said that mankind owes the child the best it has to give. 40 years. And The Convention on the Rights of the Child is remarkable in that it has virtually universal ratification, very rapid ratification. Yet, I'm afraid I cannot but emphasize the gap between rhetoric and reality. And therefore, I think the whole issue is much, much more complex than state obligations. It is much more complex than boycotting child labor. I think there's a huge amount of complexity and difficulty here. If you take a broad and quick snapshot at the rights of the child, what you see is endemic violence. Endemic violence against children, endemic exploitation of children. So these are long-standing, deep-rooted problems. And I would like to give you one story here of a child. Now, I went to Burundi last September because Amnesty was launching its report on the situation of children in that country. Just 10 days before I arrived, there was a massacre. As you know, this country has been at war for the last 10 years. No one hears about it, but a very large number of people have been killed there. And when I arrived, I was told that 178 villagers had been killed by the army. I asked the government how many women and children were there. They couldn't tell me the numbers because people had been killed so badly. They didn't know who was a child and who was an adult among the bodies. I was then told that there were 4 survivors in the hospital, so I said I would like to go see them. I went to the hospital with my colleagues, and we were taken into a large room, a little bit smaller than this, but a very large room, and put at a table. It was a bench and a table, and we were sitting there waiting for the survivors to come and meet us. The door opened at the end of the room, and I saw a child, a small child about that high. She was probably between 6 and 8 because she had lost some of her milk teeth, come in with a blanket wrapped around her body. And I asked her name, and she said her name was Claudine. I looked at that little black face, the large big eyes, and that child told me how she watched her mother, her father, her baby brother being bayoneted to death, her grandfather killed, and she said she was so small that she was able to crawl under the legs of the soldiers and get out, and they didn't see her. And a neighbor found her, wounded, lying unconscious in the forest, naked, and brought her to hospital. I saw her 10 days later. She was wrapped in a blanket because the hospital was too poor to provide her with a dress. And that child symbolizes for me the 2 scourges of poverty and war which victimize so many children, not just in Africa, but also in other countries, but I would say particularly in Africa. And I was talking to some of my colleagues who are in Porto Alegre now, and they said in Porto Alegre, the 2 key themes at the moment are war and poverty. And I think poverty is, Amnesty has worked on children's rights in the area of juvenile justice, in the area of children in armed conflict, and we are slowly getting into some economic and social rights. But there are 2 lessons that we have learned. One lesson is the important link between poverty and abuse of children's rights. And this is where I would agree with what Barnard said earlier and what you pointed out, is the complexity of these issues. I think it is very good for our conscience when we don't wear a T-shirt made by child labor. But we need to think not about our conscience, but about the child. What has happened to that child? We know that poor children are more likely to be abused by police, picked up street children. There are these social cleansing projects where street children are beaten up, killed, chased off because big business doesn't want children on the streets. We know that because of the pressure of consumer boycotts, child labor is being removed from certain factories, which is a good thing. But then the question is what happens to those children? And in many situations, those children actually end up doing more hazardous jobs, jobs that are hidden from the eyes of the export industry. Many of them go into domestic service, but there is no control of any type. Many of them end up, girls especially, as prostitutes. Then there is the other big issue, which, you're talking about child labor, but then I would like to talk about child soldiers. Mm-hmm. And that is a huge issue, that the arms industry, the production of light, small weapons, make it easier now for children to be made into killers. Children as young as 7 in parts of Africa are fighting wars.
A sobering picture as we hear it. But I would like to pass on the microphone now to the public, if we're ready, please. And have you do the questions? Can we start with him now that on your way?
Thank you. My name is Alec Kanya. I'm working as...
Do you need this one? I'm sorry, just an organizational thing.
My name is Alec Kanya. I'm working as a development dialoguer. Half of the time I'm in so-called third world countries. I think we are sitting in a third world country here because the primary cause of poverty is the poverty of our mind, of our hearts. This is primary poverty of the secondary poverty. Secondary poverty is that we cannot feed the people, we cannot care for our environment and so on. And primary poverty is sitting at the moment in Davos. And as you said, Mrs. Khan, I agree, there is a lot of rhetoric. We want to trust the richest of the rich, but they are the cause of the poverty, which is physically. Mr. Boeton, I agree that the state should take the responsibility to care for more fairness in the market, to care for more fairness for environment and people. But if the government, if the UN, unfortunately Mrs. Robinson is not here yet, she can tell us a story about, you know, if the UN has no money, she has no power. So Mr. Bush, for example, he will just push whatever he wants to do, because the UN members is very easy to make them corrupt, isn't it? So this is the main problem. How can we give the power back to the government? Even the Swiss government has 200 billion debt. We pay every hour 1 million interest, and nobody bothers about this. And if somebody is interested to hear this evening broadcasting the RS2, there is a context, and they explain how there are refugees, the rich refugees which are living in Geneva and so on, and they are the cause of the problem in our country. And I think we have to start to make development work in our country, in Switzerland, to reduce this poverty, this secondary poverty in the south.
Mrs. Khan wants to answer that, but I want to convey also that something that is being discussed as we speak now, and I think that will have a bearing on European politics. One of the big demands of the developing countries has to do with subsidies, agricultural subsidies. And Mark Malloch-Brown from the UNDP gave a figure that was shocking today. There are, in my part of the world, 30 million children living with less than $1 a day. Every European cow receives $2 a day as a subsidy. That is a sobering figure. Irene, you want to answer that, and Neil, you want to?
Yeah.
We just start Neil, and then we come back to you again.
Of course, the recurring themes or the recurring words we hear: poverty and war. And some of the countries with the highest incidence of child labour, the worst education and health services, are countries that spend enormously on defence. I can think of two major Asian countries where more than 50% of the government's budget annually goes on defence, yet less than 5% on health and education combined. I can't help feeling that where those two particular governments, just to reverse the expenditure within the budget, you would begin to see an enormous improvement in the position of children in those two countries. Now, the other question that was posed earlier, and I wanted to return to, was the question of when children are working and are removed from the workplace, what happens to those kids? You have to have a strategy. And there is a responsibility on governments to have a strategy, but also on those corporations who have profited from the use of children. And we argue across the world, and it is now being done in many places, the children must be taken out of the workplace, they must be placed in school, and the families compensated for the lost income. And where major corporations, and most of our major corporations, have benefited from child labour, where they are implicated, they must make the resources available. Some of them do. Just recently in Cambodia, when children were found in a plant producing for Nike. Nike is often the subject of much criticism, but in that particular case, Nike provided for those children to be taken out of the workplace, to be placed in school, and for the families to have a stipend that enabled them to continue to send the children to school.
Bernard and then Irene, and I would ask you to keep your answers brief so that we can really give the voice to the floor.
Yes, to reply to this participant, I would like to give one figure. In Burkina Faso, and I don't want to stigmatize any country, but I have the figure of Burkina Faso, and many other countries are like that. The budget, public official budget of Burkina Faso for basic education is 2.7%. 10 years, 15 years ago, there was a campaign by UNICEF, by other NGOs, asking, it was called the Initiative 2020, means 20% of the bilateral aid should be dedicated, granted for education, health, and sanitation, and 20% of the budget of the state who received the grant, 20% should be actually spent for education, health, and sanitation. And 15 years after, what is the result? 2.7%. It's the same in Mauritania. It's sometimes 5%, 7%. But what is the use of this amount of blah blah international convention, covenant, etc., if nobody feels obliged to respect it? And that is the main question. As I said before, we are in a world with a lot of intelligence. Where is the will to make the basic right of children implemented? Our world gives birth every year to 125 million children.
That's an interesting line of development for the conversation, birth control and the fundamentalist right groups that are against it. Eventually we will address it, but I really want to make this more interactive. So keep it short, and if you can pass the microphone.
I think we are missing an important element in the discussion which I want to inject here. We are talking about governance as a solution, but we know from our other work in human rights that governments, if they are to be a part of a solution, or corporations, if they are to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, then we need a strong system of accountability. And that is missing here. Voluntary codes of behavior work up to a certain point. Beyond that, you need legal accountability systems. It's similarly for governments. And you need them at all stages, the global, the national, and the local. There is a lot of discussion about debt relief going on at the global level. But the question is, what happens to the money that is then released? Where is it going to be spent? Because we know of situations where it is spent to beef up air defense systems. Is that why debt relief is being given? So I think one has to have much tougher questions asked, and that means having a stronger system of accountability.
Please.
I'm Albina Dubois-Rouvray from the François-Xavier Bagnoud Association, FXB, and I've been working for the past 14 years in children's issues, forced child labor with Boeton in Switzerland, child prostitution, AIDS orphans, street children. I want to say two things. First, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most ideal instrument if implemented to eradicate poverty, but it needs countries to change their constitution. It needs to take away the reservations that some countries, very often Muslim countries, have put on the articles. Now, having said that, the most powerful country in the world, the United States, has never ratified it. In order for it to become on the global agenda, we have to have American leadership, unfortunately, also on this. So there's one category of children I haven't heard you speak about at all. It is these multiplying AIDS orphans. We at FXB have made a study that proves that in the year 2010, we'll be closer to 100 million AIDS orphans and the vulnerable children around them who have no access to any of their rights, starting with education, than the figures that we hear. And we have to remember that in 1991, USAID had made a survey of the number of street children that were roaming in our mega cities, and it was then another 100 million who haven't disappeared. Some overlap, but not that many. So last night, I asked President Clinton, I said, you didn't manage to get the convention ratified while you were president, But you say you regret about Rwanda, about Sarajevo, about all these things where America didn't intervene. Wouldn't you now accept to use your charisma and your leadership to take on this issue of AIDS orphans and all the vulnerable children in the world who do not have access to basic education and who go then to fuel the ranks of the child soldiers, the terrorists, the prostitution, the criminality? And he said yes.
Yes, but then he said yes, just that, and then change the conversation. So you have to write
I certainly will, but there were
to his
two
new
other
foundation and keep him up to his word.
There were two ex-presidents with him.
Yes.
And I suggested that he bind and bond and build with them to do this coalition. And I'm asking a South African minister where I work, in Joburg, in Witbank, and Plimville, to reintegrate AIDS orphans and send them to school and have families bring them up. I'm asking you as a country, South Africa, as you have ratified and put children at the top of your agenda, could you also help in this government, global government coalition to put kids at the top of the agendas of everybody, because they don't vote and they don't buy, so they will always be forgotten.
Minister?
Well, thank you very much. If I can just latch on what my colleague said a little earlier on and what I had put before this August meeting. I think for me the most important thing is when you bond with your Minister of Finance. Because if you know, and I think you do know this, that in South Africa we've got the child support grant for everybody, not just AIDS orphans. All the children are eligible to this, and we're on a huge campaign to register all the children so that they can access, as is their right, enshrined in our constitution, to the child support grant. You also know that in South Africa we have initiated something that was not there before, that is the school feeding nutrition. And I think those things really begin to demonstrate that we as South Africans are really putting children very high on our agenda. I'm not talking about other grants, disability grant, foster grants, and so on and so on. But I think what is absolutely critical is therefore the accountability of each and every minister. What then do you say to your president who signed into your constitution? What do you say? How do you account? What have you done right through the year? And as I said to you, having put children very high on our agenda, our president expects each and every minister to write a report to say, how are you as a minister implementing the children's rights? As I say, I'm not saying that we're 100% implementing it, but I think what is very crucial is the bonding between the ministers of finance and the different ministers, so that we make available those resources that are necessary to implement the Convention of the Child. And I'm glad that at some point in time you moved away from saying AIDS orphans and talked about vulnerable children, children in distress, because we know the discrimination that goes around the children once you label them AIDS orphans. There's a lot of discrimination against them. But I think if you call them children in distress, vulnerable children, it makes a whole difference, because we're not just talking about a section of children, we're talking about all children, putting them very high on our agenda to ensure that we actually begin to implement the Convention of the Rights of the Children.
You have signed the convention, I take it?
Yes, we did. We've ratified.
And secondly, just yes or no, are you willing to ask your finance minister, with whom you have a good relationship, your foreign minister, and yourself to address this idea of other people in other governments, like the U.S. government, to sign the Children's Convention, the Child's Rights Convention?
No, we'll take up the challenge. I think it is a challenge that South Africa is prepared to take up. And you know South Africa has taken up a lot of challenges, and we're prepared to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Let me go back to the audience. Just a second, Irene. Let me go back to the audience for 3 questions, and then we can get back to the table. Over here, there's a microphone. Yes? A young man.
Okay. My name is Thomas Hofer. I think we should look for solutions to solve the problem. And we are here in Switzerland, and we are a really small country, and we are a lucky country because we have the direct democracy. And I know there is a law, if a company works in the United States, if a Swiss company works in the United States, it can get sued for a big amount of money. So we could start an Initiative, I don't know, Initiative ist auf Deutsch. So,
we understand you.
Okay. So, dass wenn Firmen, dass man, Moment, kurz.
Speak German, you know. If anybody's listening, you can speak German.
Mit Kinder, so that the companies they are convicted with labor work can't get sued here in Switzerland, and they have to pay a lot amount of money, and some part of the money should use to build schools, and the other amount of money should be used to control those companies they want to sell and import clothing from countries they have children work, because we produce a lot of clothing in Europe, like Portugal or Italy, and if that, like we as people, as citizens in Switzerland, we can start something.
An interesting idea, and of course, I do wish that you become a lawyer, and you can do that.
I have to do a lot
I think that we will depend on people like you who have interesting ideas. Over here, there's somebody was raising the hand over here. There's hope if you have interesting ideas like that, and you can put them into court. Over here, somebody was raising the hand. Well, why don't you go to this side of the room? There was somebody. Somebody was raising the hand over here. Could you give it to this gentleman here with the white shirt? Okay.
My name is Burkhard Knerik. I work for a child rights organization called Save the Children. And I have two comments. One is, I think it's important that we listen to young people, because if we talk about children's rights, then we've got a few in here. And if we don't give them enough time to explain what they want to say in a foreign language, then I think it would be difficult to discuss with them.
I see some young faces here. Very good idea.
Good.
Do you speak English, or could somebody help us translate the...
You have translation if you want.
Great. So that's a very good idea. Could we give the microphone? Are you finished?
I would only want to ask one thing towards South Africa. I think it's a good idea to deal with AIDS orphans. But I think in Southern Africa, too many governments are not doing enough to prevent the spread of AIDS. What is your approach to that, and how successful are you, and what are your plans for the future? Thanks.
Okay, let's give the voice to 3 of the young people in the audience, and then we can wrap it up from here, no? The minister can talk, and Irene. Would you like to... I don't want to impose, but there are young people. Just in German, or I'm told that. Channel 1.
Channel 1's English, Channel 3 is German.
I just wanted to say how sad it is that in Switzerland they spend almost more for the armed forces as they do for any assistance or help organization. That's really something that needs to be changed, because the army isn't really that necessary in Switzerland. And even if you saw the army going at full strength, it's not that necessary. It's really not that needed. I just wanted to make that point.
Another young person? There's somebody courageous. There's you on the here with the black sweater. You want to try? No? Come on. Tell us something. Tell us something. No? Anybody else from the young crowd? Nobody's going to judge you. We want to listen to you. No? Okay, let's turn to the table. Irene was asking for the possibility of answering something, and then Bernard, and then we go back to you, Nana.
I wanted to take the floor for a couple of reasons, and I was very pleased to hear the comment from the Swiss gentleman about the initiative, and I'll tell you why. Because I think we look to American leadership too much. I see no reason for a convention that has almost near universal ratification on a subject that touches each and every one of us, why we cannot take things in our hand. And I would hope that since we are here in Europe, that the Europeans will take a very strong stand on the issue of children. And that is why and what struck me was when you listen to the young people, the Swiss initiative, the issue of the Swiss defense budget, young people today are willing to take responsibility. And I think children's issues have to become everyone's responsibility. And we should not be looking outwards for leadership.
Bernard?
That was the point I wanted to make.
Bernard?
Yes, I would like to reply to the young man who raised the question of criminalization of companies. I have not the reply, but I would like to raise a question and to mention one point. We are nowadays in a present situation. We have hundreds of international conventions, which, when they are ratified, they are the law of the countries who have ratified. In the companies, within the companies, you have now code of conduct, you have ethical codes, you have deontological codes, etc., etc. But these codes are not running, not very much. Sometimes, as Mr. explained, there are some progress in some places. But globally, it's not satisfactory. But on the other hand, I'm not completely sure that the criminalization would be also the solution. And it has to be found another way of giving obligations, constraint to states, to companies, between the convention, which are not efficient, and the criminalization, which is not the solution. If you put a head of state or a minister in prison, so what? You see? So I am a bit afraid that in our discussion, in the international debate, I am a bit afraid that we find the only last solution would be the law, the criminal law, the penal law. I'm not sure. It has to be a mobilization of the public opinion, a strong request, a strong demand from the public opinion, means you and me, in front of the state, asking to implement the obligation. I'm not sure that expecting much from criminalization of the issue.
Now, Neil, you want to say something?
Yeah. On the other hand, there is something to be said for making corporations legally responsible. You know, corporations have lots of legal responsibilities at the moment. Intellectual property rights. If one company copies the label of another, they find themselves in court. But if a company is responsible for the exploitation of 10,000 children, there is no court before which they are brought. So I think that you have a strong point there, and it is one that is pursued in many quarters. Many of us would like to see, for example, the International Labour Organization having much more teeth and being able to ensure that the standards that it has established, its various conventions, can be implemented and enforced in every corner of the world. But really, the discussion we're having about children are only part of the equation. And I think we need to go to the comment that was made by the new president of Brazil, Lula, yesterday. What we need across the world is a new economic order. It is obscene what we are seeing in the world today. Ultra-rich on one hand and ultra-poor on the other. And I'm not opposed to globalization. I believe that it is right that people in every part of the world should share the resources of the world. And what we need is a globalization that puts people before profit. A globalization that makes available healthcare and education to everyone. a globalization in which everybody has the opportunity to work, reasonable hours for a living wage, a wage that enables them to feed and clothe themselves and their families, put a roof over their heads, send their kids to school, and have some medical care when they're ill. That's not too much to ask, surely, in this millennium. But it is denied to millions, hundreds of millions of working families and unemployed people across the world. What we need, as Lula said, is a new economic order.
Minister.
Well, thank you very much. I just half suspected that the issue of HIV and AIDS would land on my lap as the Minister of Health of South Africa. But I'm not going to talk generally about what we do in South Africa on HIV and AIDS, because that would take a whole 2 hours, if I may. Let me just zero in around the youth and the children. We in South Africa have got a very robust life skills program, which includes, amongst other things, HIV and AIDS. It's very robust. Teachers are being trained to do that. That is in schools. For the children out of school, we also have what we call a peer education program. Your Love Life program, which is absolutely fantastic, I must say. Right now, the youth of South Africa have just left South Africa. For the first time, they are rowing their boats going to Rio. And I am hoping to go and meet the youth of South Africa who have ventured into skills that they had never been exposed to before. Obviously, there's also a social support program that we have. But let me just quickly then also say the one other thing which perhaps the world really just does not know is that on the continent, and I am brave to say, in the whole world, South Africa has a very comprehensive mother-to-child transmission program. We have the hugest program, a very comprehensive program. Yes, we give nevirapine, and it is not true that we only started giving nevirapine because there was a constitutional judgment. We had already, as government, taken a decision that we were going to implement that program. So it's doing well. We're watching it. We want to see how it progresses. But we're very cautious as South Africans that whatever we do must be beneficial to the women of our country. The most important thing that we did not want to do was just to inject nevirapine without attending to issues of poverty, issues of hunger, and issues of starvation. So we worked out a very comprehensive program, and I am sure, unlike other countries, where we make sure that we feed the mothers and the babies, just to make sure that we attend to this critical issue, which I am hoping the world is going to run with very soon, and that is the nutrition of the hungry people in the developing world. Thank you.
I would like to introduce the fact that we have been hearing a lot the word preventive or preemptive. This time preventive, they say. What we just heard is a prevention campaign. They are taking care in terms of education of the people that could be vulnerable to AIDS, and they are educating their people. And I would like to introduce to the room, if anybody wants to take it either in the table or down, the idea of birth control. Can it be so alien to children's rights, or should the first right be that you come into a world that is waiting for you and that you're a desirable event on somebody's life? Anybody downstairs? You've already spoken. Anybody else? Yes. Well,
I'll take that issue of birth control, because I think birth control means for women to control their bodies. Right? So we move from the area of children into the area of gender very rapidly. And a lot of the problems lie because women do not have control over their bodies, do not have control over their lives. And this again adds the complexity of children's issues. It's not just birth control. It's what rights you have to a sexual life, what you do with yourself. Are you someone else's chattel or not? What do children mean to your family life? Are children an added income? Are they a resource for you as well? And these are very complex social issues. And I think we need to get down from the rhetoric, from the abstract, to some very concrete issues down on the ground. Now, in my own country, birth rates have fallen dramatically. I come from Bangladesh, one of the most heavily populated countries, but today Bangladesh is being put up as one of those countries where rapidly birth rates have fallen, not through any form of coercion or any form of birth control as such, but primarily by allowing women to gather together, to allow women to have more access to employment and to education. And that has done the trick. So I think it is through those measures of education and employment that you find solutions. And could I just, because we've been talking a lot, and I would like to bring some concreteness into our discussion. Conventions are very important. They're up there. Reality is down here. And between conventions and the reality on the ground, you need some things. And I think you need two things. On the one hand, you need robust national laws, good national laws to apply them. And many countries that have signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child don't have those national laws. That's a big thing we have to remember. We have to force governments to also get laws introduced. And on the second side, you need some forces that bring the political will on the leaders, political leaders, corporate leaders, social leaders, to bring about change. And that comes through information, through education, through awareness, through popular mobilization. And when those two things work together, then you bring change down here for children or for any other issue.
It is interesting that we start our wrapping part of the session with an empowering proposition. You have maybe not the possibility of knowing exactly where the garments that you're buying come from now, but you can start asking the question. It won't change, as Bernard was saying, the fate of all the children, but it could help. You will have also the possibility of doing new and creative things like the ones that the young man was proposing. And as we wrap up the session, I would just like to share the idea that as complex as it is, there is a sense of empowerment that I feel around the room, and one very concrete thing that could come out, Minister, you are publicly here saying that you would become a champion for the ratifying of the Children Convention. Although it is true, it's not the only answer. We don't need to look all the time towards what Washington, D.C. needs to do. We can do other things here together. That's it for me. I would like the panel to finish with a final comment and to thank you, all of you, for being here with us today. Bernard, you want to start with your final remarks?
I will start to finish.
We're starting to finish, but let me tell you something.
Yes.
We're here. I want to finish on time. It's 5 minutes from the end, but we can stay here, and whoever wants to ask more or to comment something, maybe we can use another 15 minutes to do it, but out of respect for the timetable, I'm asked to. Etienne, you're telling me something there? Yes, we should finish on time. I'm saying that we will finish on time, but whoever wants to stay, we can stay and we can talk amongst ourselves. But it will be wrapped up promptly at 1:45. So, Bernard, if you want to start your end remarks.
End remarks. Never forget that every year in the world, 125 million children are born, which means within the next 50 years, between 3, 4, or 5 billion children will be born. If there is no state international commitment to ensure basic education, health, and sanitation for these billions of children in the next 50 years, the humanity will come back to the situation of jungle.
Yes, last year I met some working children in Nepal. One young boy said to me, "I cannot go anywhere, I'm a prisoner." And I thought that summed up the position of those youngsters. It was late at night. And I believe we all have a responsibility to declare war on the jailers of these youngsters. We all have a responsibility to smash the gates that deny their freedom and pull down the walls that are keeping them in enslavement. We need to release these youngsters and enable all of them to reclaim their childhood. That requires efforts on the part of civil society, of corporations, and of governments. Governments have a responsibility to protect the young by law, provide the infrastructure on health, on education. And that's where the responsibility should lie. The private sector, corporations, have a responsibility to ensure that children are not exploited through employment in any part of their production. And some of our European companies are exploiting children today. They claim they don't know it, but their buyers have to be blind not to see that it's happening. And civil society, I think all of us, whatever country we live in, we have a responsibility to demand that the country has an adequate social infrastructure, that is, education, health, and the other services that are needed for the development of a population. And if we make the demands in our own countries, those demands can then spread beyond the boundaries of our countries. If that infrastructure is in place around the world, then the future would be very much brighter for the millions of children who we hear are being born every year.
Thank you, Neil. Minister?
Thank you very much. I think for me what is absolutely important and critical is to ensure that our constitutions enshrine the rights of the children and the women. Because if you separate the two, you'll never succeed. In South Africa, our constitution, chapter 9 of our constitution, is about the rights. And one of the enshrined rights is the rights to your own reproductive health. And that, of course, you can now unfold into a number of programs. But that gives the women the right to choose, the right to make the necessary choices around your emancipation and also around issues of reproductive health. And so we were brave enough as South Africans early on in our new dispensation to enact a law that allows women, amongst other things, to terminate pregnancy if they so wish. And it's their right. It's not that anybody forces them. But parallel to that, we also have got a very robust contraceptive program. So I think for me, the issue of the right to your reproductive health becomes absolutely critical. And I'm hoping that next time when we meet, we'll also be discussing issues about women's emancipation, gender, and children. I think these are inseparable as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Irene, please.
Thank you. Neil talked about governments, corporations, and ordinary people making a difference here. I would like to also take the three levels of approaches, but in a different way. About international law and treaties, about national laws and implementation, and on the ground, the public will to bring about change. And I think the public will to bring about change, is the most powerful, the most dynamic force here that we are talking about. And I hope that all of you as Amnesty International is a membership-based organization. We have 1.8 million ordinary people, some of whom are here in this audience, who believe that we can change the world on human rights. And how can we do it? Through our demand, our commitment, and our persistence. I hope you will ask about where your T-shirt is made, but I hope you will ask more. I hope you will ask who is producing arms. I hope you will ask what is happening to defense budgets. I hope you will ask what is happening to development budgets. Keep asking how laws are applied. Keep asking. And don't be satisfied by just laws being created or treaties being signed. The real question is there a change on the ground? What is happening to real children? Because we are talking about real changes in the lives of real people. Thank you.
Thank you very much all for coming here. I wish to see you next year. And on my side, the only thing that I would say is that I would not want to wage war, but to ask for an armistice and to have both governments, corporations, and citizens empowered, conscient of their obligation to introduce the idea of giving a better life to children into their daily life. And finally, to stress the idea of complexity and the fact that this new economic order does have to come, but we have to be aware of any populism vent so that we understand that models have been tried before, and it's hard to think that they were not tried in good faith, in which there was a class warfare, and that did not work very well. We all know that. So we just need to try harder, like Davos is doing, to get the two sides together and work jointly. Here, it's a very good example of how we can do that. We're not enemies. It's not the enemy of 2 blocks away. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us. Bye-bye.
I am